What if everything you've been taught about money is backwards? And that's exactly why it's not working. Because the two most powerful figures of biblical wealth, Abraham and Solomon, never followed the system people still trust today. And if you stay with me, you'll see the exact pattern they used, and why thinking differently might be the only thing separating you from real prosperity. There's something strange about the way some people prosper, and it has nothing to do with money. Because if you go back to the beginning, before land, before livestock, before any visible sign of abundance, there was a man who already carried something inside him that didn't match his reality. Abraham. He wasn't surrounded by wealth. He wasn't established. He didn't have proof. And yet, somehow, he moved through life as if something had already been decided, not in arrogance, but in alignment. He made decisions like someone who expected provision. He walked like someone who wasn't negotiating survival. He responded to uncertainty as if it wasn't permanent. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because most people are doing the exact opposite. They wait to feel secure before they act secure. They wait to have before they allow themselves to become. They wait for evidence before they permit belief. But Abraham reversed that order completely. He became before anything appeared, and that raises a question that almost no one wants to face. What if the problem was never your income, but the way you see yourself before it changes? Because identity is not decoration, it's direction. It determines what you accept, what you reject, what you build, and what you silently sabotage. And if that's true, then Abraham wasn't just a man of faith. He was operating from a pattern that doesn't start in the outside world, but quietly rewrites it. But here's what most people miss. Faith alone didn't explain everything, because later, another man would come, and instead of just living this pattern, he would break it down, organize it, and expose the mechanics behind it. Solomon. And what he revealed doesn't just explain why Abraham thought the way he did. It explains why some people build something that lasts, while others spend their entire lives trying to catch up. But before we get there, you need to see the invisible code Abraham was already living by. There is a difference between believing something and operating from it. And Abraham didn't just believe he would be blessed. He moved like it was already true, not emotionally, structurally. Because when you look closely at his life, you start to notice something almost unsettling. He didn't make decisions based on what he had in his hands, but on what he believed was already assigned to his future. That changes everything. Because most people calculate based on limitation. They measure risk through scarcity. They hesitate because they don't see guarantees. They protect what little they have because they're afraid of losing it. But Abraham didn't behave like someone trying to protect survival. He behaved like someone managing a promise. And that subtle shift creates a completely different pattern of action. He separates when necessary. He moves when called. He builds without knowing how everything will unfold, not recklessly, but without the internal resistance that traps most people. And here's where it gets deeper. Because this wasn't positive thinking. This was identity alignment. He didn't wake up every day trying to convince himself he would prosper. He acted from the assumption that his life was already under a different kind of provision. And when identity changes, behavior follows automatically. You stop negotiating your value. You stop tolerating environments that shrink you. You stop making decisions just to survive the moment. You begin to choose based on what is consistent with who you believe you are. And that's where most people get stuck, because they try to change outcomes without changing identity. They chase money without confronting the internal pattern that keeps resetting their reality. So, even when opportunity appears, they hesitate. Even when growth is possible, they self-sabotage. Even when doors open, they don't feel ready, not because they lack ability, but because something inside them still believes they are not the kind of person that sustains abundance. And this is why two people can receive the same opportunity and produce completely different results. One expands, the other contracts. One builds, the other protects. Same opportunity, different identity. Abraham understood something most people never articulate. You don't rise to what you desire. You stabilize at what you believe you are, and once that internal ceiling is set, everything else starts to orbit around it. Your decisions, your relationships, your financial patterns, your tolerance for growth. All of it adjusts to match that internal definition. So the real shift doesn't start with strategy. It starts with alignment. And that's exactly where Abraham lived. Not chasing, not forcing, not reacting, but responding from a place that already assumed provision, direction, and expansion. And that creates a tension. Because if this is true, then most people aren't stuck because of what they lack. They're stuck because of what they still believe about themselves. And this is where it gets even more precise, because Abraham reveals the internal pattern. But he never explains how to operationalize it. He lived it. But he didn't break it down. And that's why, later, another figure becomes essential. Because what Abraham embodied, someone else would translate into structure, timing, and execution. And that someone was Joseph. Most people never notice when things start going wrong, because it doesn't look like failure at first. It looks like effort. It looks like trying harder, doing more, chasing opportunity, staying busy, staying productive. But underneath all of that, there's a silent inversion happening, a reversal that almost no one questions. They are trying to have before they become. And that single mistake rewrites everything. Because when you try to have before becoming, every decision you make is driven by pressure. You accept what you shouldn't accept. You rush what should take time. You force what should grow. And slowly, without realizing it, you start building from instability. This is why so many people can earn more and still feel stuck, because the internal structure didn't change. So the new income doesn't expand them. It exposes them. More money, same identity, creates chaos. More opportunity, same thinking, creates anxiety. More access, same patterns, creates self-sabotage. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because from the outside, it looks like progress, but internally, it feels like tension. Like something doesn't fit, like you're holding something that doesn't belong to you yet. That's not lack of capacity. That's misalignment. Because when identity is behind reality, everything feels unstable. You doubt your decisions. You second-guess your moves. You fear losing what you just gained. So instead of building, you start protecting. And protection is the opposite of expansion. This is why people plateau. Not because they reached their limit, but because they reached the edge of who they believe they are. And once you hit that edge, something inside you starts pulling everything back to what feels familiar. Even if familiar means smaller. Even if familiar means stuck. Even if familiar means constantly starting over. That's the pattern, and it's invisible to most people because they're focused on results, not roots. They change jobs. They change strategies, they change environments, but they don't change the internal framework driving all of it. So the same outcome repeats, just with different details. And this is where Abraham stands in complete contrast. He didn't wait for reality to validate him. He aligned first, so when movement came, he didn't hesitate. When separation was required, he didn't cling. When uncertainty appeared, he didn't collapse. Because he wasn't trying to become in the middle of the process. He had already decided who he was before the process began. And that removes friction. That removes internal conflict. That removes the constant negotiation most people live inside. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This pattern doesn't just delay prosperity. It distorts it. Because when someone finally gets what they were chasing without becoming who can sustain it, they either lose it or become trapped by it. They work harder to maintain. They live with constant fear of losing. They become dependent on what they created. That's not prosperity. That's pressure with better numbers. And this is why so many people feel exhausted even after making it, because they built something their identity can't carry. So instead of freedom, they experience weight. Instead of peace, they experience tension. Instead of expansion, they experience maintenance. And this is exactly the trap that repeats across generations. People inherit resources, but not structure. They receive opportunity, but not identity. They access wealth, but not wisdom, and the cycle resets, which leads to the question that changes everything. If becoming comes first, then how do you translate that into something real? Because Abraham shows the internal shift, but he doesn't show the system. And without structure, even the right identity can drift. That's where everything begins to escalate. Because when this principle reaches Solomon, it stops being invisible. It becomes engineered. The world teaches income. Work more. Earn more. Negotiate better. Climb higher. And at first, it sounds logical because income feels like progress. But Solomon saw something deeper, something almost invisible to anyone trapped inside that system. Income is not structure, it's flow, without foundation, and flow without structure eventually disappears, because income depends on time. You work, you earn. You stop, it slows. You lose the source, it ends. That's not wealth. That's dependence, disguised as progress. Solomon didn't reject work. He rejected dependence on linear effort. He understood that if your life is tied to what you produce with your time, then your future is limited by your presence. So he built differently, not around effort, but around structure. And this is where everything shifts, because structure changes the game completely. Structure holds value. Structure organizes flow. Structure protects what is built, while most people focus on how much comes in. Solomon focused on where it sits, how it moves, and what it becomes over time. That's a different level of thinking, because once structure is in place, money stops being the center. It becomes a tool inside a system, and systems multiply. This is why he didn't just accumulate wealth. He designed environments where wealth could circulate, expand, and return. Trade routes, alliances, assets that produced without constant involvement. Not random growth, engineered expansion. And here's the part most people miss. Structure doesn't just multiply, it protects, because without structure, even large income collapses under pressure. One bad season, and everything shakes. One wrong decision, and everything leaks. One interruption, and everything slows down. But when structure exists, the system absorbs impact. It adapts. It continues. And that's why Solomon's wealth wasn't just large, it was resilient. He wasn't chasing opportunity. He was positioned for it. And that difference is everything. Because when you rely on income, you must constantly look for the next step. When you build structure, opportunity comes into alignment with what already exists. You don't scramble. You respond. You don't force. You position. And this is where the contrast becomes uncomfortable. Because most people are not building structure. They are stacking income. Multiple streams, side projects, extra work, all still dependent on their time, their attention, their presence. It looks diversified, but it's still fragile, because remove the person, and everything stops. Solomon built what continues without him. That's the difference between effort and design, between survival and sovereignty. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because suddenly the question changes. It's no longer, how do I earn more? It becomes, what am I building that can sustain itself? And that question reveals everything. It exposes where you are dependent, where you are exposed, where your growth has no protection, and more importantly, it reveals why so many people work their entire lives and still feel like they are running. But here's where it gets even more serious, because even with the right identity, and even with structure, there is something that can quietly destroy everything: Not loudly, not instantly, but slowly, consistently, invisibly, and most people don't even realize they're feeding it. It doesn't collapse overnight. There's no dramatic moment, no clear warning. It just starts small. A decision here, a shortcut there, a quiet compromise that feels harmless at the time. And slowly, something begins to erode. Not your income first, your foundation. Because there is a pattern that destroys prosperity without announcing itself. Debt, dependence, and the illusion of control. It feels like progress. You leverage to grow faster. You commit more than you can sustain. You stretch beyond your structure because the opportunity looks too good to miss. But what you're really doing is disconnecting from the very pattern that creates stability. Because the moment your decisions are no longer supported by what you already control, you lose position. And once position is lost, pressure takes over. This is what Solomon warned about in a way that most people ignore. Debt doesn't just affect money, it rewrites your behavior. Because when you owe, you don't decide freely. You react. You filter every move through obligation. You hesitate where you should act. You accept what you should refuse. And, without realizing it, your entire life starts orbiting around something external. That's not strategy, that's constraint. And here's where it becomes dangerous, because it doesn't feel like slavery at first. It feels like acceleration, more access, more expansion, more immediate results. But beneath that, something shifts. You are no longer building from strength. You are maintaining from pressure. And pressure changes how you think. It shortens your vision. It distorts your judgment. It makes you prioritize survival over structure. So instead of making decisions aligned with who you are becoming, you start making decisions just to keep things running. And that's the silent collapse. Not loss, misalignment. Because now, your identity says one thing, your structure says another, and your decisions start contradicting both. This is why people lose what they built. Not because they didn't know how to grow, but because they lost the discipline that sustained the growth. They abandoned boundaries. They overcommitted. They trusted momentum more than wisdom. And slowly, everything that once expanded begins to leak. Time leaks. Energy leaks. Resources leak. Until one day, what looked strong reveals itself as fragile. And here's the part most people never connect. This doesn't just affect individuals, it repeats across generations. Because when structure is broken, what gets passed forward is not wisdom, it's instability. People inherit assets, but not discipline. They receive opportunity, but not boundaries. They gain access, but not understanding. And the cycle resets again, which leads to the missing connection. Because now you've seen the identity of Abraham. You've seen the structure of Solomon. You've seen the breakdown that destroys both, but there is still something missing. Something that connects vision to execution. Something that turns intention into survival-proof strategy. And this is where everything finally locks into place. Because there was one man who didn't just believe, didn't just build, he managed: Joseph. Joseph didn't start with power. He didn't inherit land. He didn't control systems. He didn't even have freedom. And yet, he became the one person everyone depended on when everything collapsed. That doesn't happen by chance. It happens because he understood something most people ignore. Vision without management fails. Because it's easy to believe. It's powerful to build. But it's discipline that sustains everything. Joseph is where the pattern becomes practical. Because while Abraham shows identity, and Solomon shows structure, Joseph shows execution. He takes something invisible and turns it into something measurable. When abundance came, he didn't celebrate it blindly. He organized it. He didn't trust the moment. He prepared for what the moment couldn't sustain. And this is where most people break the pattern. Because when things are going well, they relax, they spend more, They assume it will continue. They treat growth like permanence. But Joseph did the opposite. He treated abundance as temporary and responsibility as permanent. That shift changes everything, because now you don't consume everything that comes in, you assign it, you direct it, you give it purpose, and suddenly your resources stop being random. They become structured. Joseph didn't just store, he designed a system, different locations, defined portions, clear timing, not chaos, order. And order is what carries you when conditions change, because eventually, they always do. And when the famine came, it revealed something brutally clear. Those who consumed everything depended on others. Those who managed wisely became the source. That's the dividing line. Not effort, not opportunity. Management. Because management is what transforms a temporary gain into lasting provision. And here's where the connection becomes undeniable. Abraham believed before he saw. Joseph prepared before it was needed. Solomon built systems that continued. 3 different lives. Same pattern, identity, management, structure. Remove one, and everything weakens. Have all 3, and something stabilizes. Something that doesn't collapse when pressure comes. Something that doesn't disappear when conditions shift. Something that doesn't depend on constant effort to survive. And this is where most people feel the gap. Because they've believed at some level. They've worked hard. They've even built things. But something still feels unstable, like it could fall apart, like it requires too much maintenance, like it depends too much on them. That's not failure, that's missing alignment. Because when identity, management, and structure are not connected, you can grow fast and still feel fragile. But when they align, growth stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like flow. Not because things are easier, but because they are ordered. And once you see this, you start to realize something that changes everything. Maybe the issue was never lack of opportunity. Maybe it was never lack of effort. Maybe it was something far more subtle. The pattern you've been following was never designed to sustain you, and that realization doesn't accuse you. It frees you. Maybe nothing is actually missing. Not opportunity, not ability, not even direction. Maybe what feels like delay is something else entirely, because when you step back and look at the pattern clearly, something becomes undeniable. Abraham didn't wait to become. Joseph didn't wait to prepare. Solomon didn't wait to build. They moved from a place most people never fully enter. Alignment. Not perfect conditions, not certainty, not control. Alignment. And when alignment exists, something shifts internally before anything changes externally. Decisions stop feeling forced. Opportunities stop feeling random. Growth stops feeling unstable. Not because life becomes predictable, but because your foundation becomes consistent. And this is where the perspective changes. Because instead of asking, "Why isn't this working?" a different question starts to emerge. What pattern am I operating from? Because patterns don't just influence outcomes. They shape them. Quietly, repeatedly, predictably. And once a pattern is in place, results follow it, whether you realize it or not. That's why effort alone can't fix it. That's why more income doesn't resolve it. That's why new opportunities don't guarantee anything. Because if the pattern underneath remains the same, the outcome eventually returns to what feels familiar. But here's the shift. Once you see the pattern, you are no longer inside it unconsciously. You can observe it, interrupt it, realign it, and that changes the trajectory. Not instantly, but inevitably, because alignment doesn't demand perfection. It demands awareness and a decision. A decision to stop building from pressure, a decision to stop reacting from fear, a decision to stop expanding without structure, and to begin moving differently, more intentional, more ordered, more aligned with something that isn't temporary. Because maybe you were never meant to chase stability. Maybe you were meant to build it. Maybe you were never meant to depend on what comes and goes, but to create something that holds, even when everything shifts. And if that's true, then what you're experiencing right now isn't lack. It's exposure. Exposure to a pattern that no longer sustains who you are becoming. And that's not a problem. It's a signal. A quiet invitation to step out of what was inherited and into something that was always available, but only becomes visible when you're ready to see it.